Um, Today is the first of 3 archaeology lectures that I'm going to be doing on this cruise. And if you're staying on to San Diego, I think I've got 3 or 4 more archaeology lectures as we head farther north. We're going to be talking the area of the Nazca culture and some of the stuff from down on the north coast of Chile. Let me start out by saying a little bit about myself. I'm a geographer. I taught in a geography department, but I also am a registered professional archaeologist. At Fresno State, I was never allowed to teach an archaeology class. But for decades, I taught a course called the Geography of Ancient Peru, which was an archaeology class, but it didn't have archaeology in the title, therefore a geographer could do that. I first was in Peru in 1966, December of 66, did my master's thesis on a half geography, history, and half archaeology subject. And then for my dissertation, I decided I wanted to follow up on the archaeology part of it. Did field work, excavated and stuff for my dissertation. And I was back in Peru working as an archaeologist in the 70s and into the mid-80s. I always said, even though I trained at UCLA in California archaeology, I didn't want to do California archaeology because compared to the stuff in Peru, California was sort of blah. Came back from a year and a half in Peru in December of '85, and one of my friends in Fresno came to me and said, would you like to join me on an archaeology project in Peru, starting in California, starting in '86 and '87. And I said, really, I'm not interested. And he said, you would be in charge of running the finances and administering the project. I'll do the archaeology. And I said, no, I'm really not kind of interested. And he said, our budget over the couple of years is probably going to be $1 million. And I said, where do I sign? So in the 80s and into the 90s, I did a number of California projects, and I started working as an independent California archaeologist, doing contract work for companies and individuals and stuff. Did that all the way up to 2004, a few years before I retired. The last 7 years, I did a project for the federal government that had nothing to do with archaeology or geography, and you'd have to ask me to tell you about it, but I'd have to get you to swear to secrecy what it was all about. But again, we had a budget of over $1 million, so did that project. I'm going to show you this chart in a couple of the lectures, in fact, the next 2 lectures. It's a Peruvian time chart. Some of you are probably familiar with the Incas up there at the top. What you may not be familiar with is that the Incas, who spread all across the Andes, from south central Chile all the way up to the Colombia-Ecuador border, were the third of a set of cultures that spread all across the Andes. We refer to those as the horizons. The Incas are the late horizon. They're the last one. But there were 2 earlier times when a single culture, or in one case 2 cultures, spread across most of the Andes. And those are referred to as the middle horizon and the early horizon. In between the horizons, there are what we refer to as the intermediate cultures. There's an early one and a late one. The early one is between the early horizon and the middle horizon. The late one is between the middle horizon and the late horizon. And the culture that I'm going to be talking about first here today is the Nazca. They are one of an example of early intermediate cultures. Throughout the Andes, there are lots of small cultures in relatively small geographical areas. The Nazca are simply one of those. I need to explain a couple of terms, and I'll use this in the next couple lectures. In Peru, a huaco, is a ceramic pot, usually a fairly high status ceramic pot, something that you might find in a ritual context or in a grave offering. A huaca is a adobe brick pyramid, or perhaps a cemetery, or perhaps some sacred hilltop, something of sort of ritual significance. And the third term is a huaquero. A huaquero is a grave robber. Grave robbers or huaqueros find huacos in huacas. Okay? So we're going to talk about all of those. A huaco is a ceramic pot. And for the Nazca culture on the south coast of Peru, this is a nice fancy polychrome multicolored Nazca pot. And again here and here. In future lectures, actually after we leave Lima, I'll be spending a lot of time talking about huacos. But these are typical Nazca pots. That last one is in the form of a killer whale. This is either a lobster or a crayfish. These would be found in burials, particularly by grave robbers or huaqueros. And for the Nazca area, this is a typical looted cemetery. These are not bombed out areas. Those are looted graves. Looks like it's been a aerial bombing practice area. And these last two pictures are ones that I've taken while flying over the Nazca lines. Here's the same place down on the ground, or here. And that's a typical looted tombs. These people were putting people into shaft tombs, and down at the bottom of that shaft tomb, the huaqueros would be looking for a mummy bundle. This is the whole coast of Peru from north central Chile. When we get to Copiapo, everything north of Copiapo all the way to the Ecuadorian border is going to be a desert. And if you put somebody into a grave, they will turn into a naturally created mummy. Or here. The area around Nazca is famous for cranial deformation. They altered babies' skulls by wrapping something around their head and getting these elongated skulls. Also, the Nazca culture is famous for trophy heads. They took the head off of a opposing warrior and turned it into a trophy head. In many cases, these will have the actual skin, hair, be dried out. If it's a trophy head, it usually has a hole in the forehead and a hole at the back of the head so they could string a rope through and carry it around, like that one. There is an archaeological site at Nazca that if you fly over the Nazca lines, you probably won't hear about very much, but there is an important archaeological site there, and it's called Carhuachi. The interesting thing about Carhuachi is that although it's got a lot of adobe brick pyramids, it has virtually no evidence of people living there. It's a ceremonial site. People would go in and do things there, but they would not live at that spot. There's no garbage piles to speak of. This is a Google Earth image. We're actually looking from an angle at the south coast of Peru. Paracas Peninsula. When we leave Chile and head towards Lima, we will stop at the port of San Martin for the town of Pisco, and some of you will be getting off there and doing things in that area. It's a very distinctive peninsula. And something else to point out, you can see where the border of Chile is and Peru. If you look at a map of South America, there'll be an angle change between the coast of Peru, which runs northwest-southeast, and the coast of Chile, which runs basically north-south. So you can always spot about where the border is between the two countries. There's Lake Titicaca, and on this image, we're looking all across South America. At the very top, that's the Atlantic Ocean. So the east side of the Andes, very, very wide, flat. Coast of Peru, very narrow coastal plain in most cases. And that's about where Nazca is located. Here, another Google Earth image, and there's about where Lima is. Again, you can see where the Chile-Peru border is, where it changes direction, and Nazca is about there. Carhuachi is an archaeological site. It was first excavated by an American from Columbia University, William Duncan Strong, in the 40s, I think, 40s, early 50s. A woman from the University of Illinois, Helene Silverman, excavated here in the 80s, and since then it's been excavated by an Italian group. It's located about there. Down here in south coast of Peru, there are some rivers, but the rivers are very, very tiny. There's not much irrigated agriculture with them. Right at Carhuachi, you can see a little bit of green. That's this very small river valley. And the site of Carhuachi is this whole area in the foreground. Doesn't look like much. In this Google Earth image, you can pretty much make out that there's something there. In this photo image, you can see a little bit better that there's probably some pyramids there. In the bottom right, again, that's a looted cemetery. And here's that same looted cemetery from down on the ground. But it has been excavated a number of different times, and particularly an Italian group has been doing some reconstruction. There are a series of temple pyramids here, or wakas. I think that's the largest one. And this stuff here in the foreground where they've put plaster on the walls, that's all from the recent reconstructions. This is what it looked like before any of the reconstruction. It's just adobe brick structures. And this drawing gives you a better sense of what it might have looked like with a series of these pyramids, very little in the way of any living areas at the site. I'm going to show you a modern spot nearby. I first saw this place in the 1970s, and I've been there a couple of times since then. It's called the Virgin of Yauca. And in the colonial period and up to the modern time, this was a pilgrimage center. This was a ceremonial center. It's a church out in the middle of the desert. There is nothing around it. First times I was there were probably 50 or 60 houses. They were only occupied for, at best, 1 week every year during the annual celebration. But a big fancy church out in the middle of nowhere. And if you're there, when I was there, and if you were there when it wasn't the celebration, there was virtually no one around. In the 70s, there were about 2 families that lived there permanently. Today, there are probably about 100 people that live at the site. But every year, people will come out from dozens of miles away. In fact, the nearest town is about 30 miles away. And people will actually come from 100 miles away. They'll come from Lima, which is about 250 or 300 miles away, walking most of the way. And so you have these processions of pilgrims that come out for this one spot, this one ceremonial center. This is the last couple of pictures I've taken off the web during the celebration when it's a big crowd. This is a picture I took about 4 or 5 years ago, just before COVID, in fact. The town now has a paved road out to it. And again, there's probably 100 people that live there permanently. So that's the modern version of Carhuachi. But people were doing stuff in the past, like today, going out on a pilgrimage to a spot in this area. The Nazca lines are what we call geoglyphs, markings on the Earth's surface. Most of them are lines. Many of them have figurative drawings. One of the popular theories about this place that came about in the 1960s with a book called The Chariots of the Gods by Eric von Daniken. Even today, if you look on the History Channel, it doesn't take more than a few days watching the History Channel, that program Ancient Aliens, before you'll hear them talking about the Nazca lines as being the place where the flying saucers, the unidentified flying objects, or the ovnis landed. I show you this picture that I took back in 1970 when I was doing my dissertation work, just to show you the lines that driving once on the desert here would make. The desert soil is light colored, but over centuries, over thousands of years, it gets a little bit of patina of dark color on it. If you drive on it, it destroys that dark color, and you see the lighter color of the desert. If you've tried to land a flying saucer on this sort of sandy desert, what you do is you kind of blow up all sorts of sand all over the place. It's not a place where you could have an airport flying saucer place out in the desert. When people began to fly over this area back in the 1920s and 1930s, the pilots reported seeing lines in the desert. And one of the first people to study those lines was a guy by the name of Paul Kosak. Very interesting fella. German background, came to the United States. He actually did his doctoral dissertation in Germany, came to the United States and started teaching at Long Island University. He was a polymath. He taught economics and history, and he chaired essentially the social science department there. He also ran and directed the university orchestra. And in the 1930s, he started taking the University of Long Island orchestra on voyages, not on cruise ships, but on passenger liners that were going to the Caribbean and all the way down to South America. And by the middle and late 30s, he was very interested in Peruvian archaeology and started studying it. He actually took a sabbatical leave later in the 40s to spend a whole year studying Peruvian archaeology in 1947 and 48. There's Paul Kosak. He started to write a book. In fact, he was going to write 2 different books about the archaeology of Peru. In the 1950s, when he thought he could get his book published, he was teaching at Long Island University, he actually had to go into hiding. If you remember, the 1950s were the Red Scare, when people were being denounced, being in the State Department as communists and on university campuses as communists. People were suspected of being communists. Kosak was a communist. There's no question about it. So he actually had to go in hiding for several years, and he wasn't able to get the books that he was working on published before he died in 1958. One of his friends, Paul Shadell from University of Texas, ultimately got one of the books published in 1965, and seeing that book was one of the things that got me interested in studying some stuff in Peru. I was trying to confirm or denounce or overturn some of Kosak's ideas, so it's very influential in my history. When he was in Peru in 1938-39, he ran into a woman, a fairly young German woman, that he convinced that she could help him study the Nazca lines. There's a woman by the name of Maria Reiki, and there's the 2 of them. She has an interesting history. She was born in Germany in 1903 with a very high-status family. Her father was a high-status officer in the German army. Unfortunately, he was killed in the First World War. So the family was not quite as wealthy or well-to-do after he died. She was able to finish her studies as a high school student and then go to university. She chose to study mainly mathematics. A young lady in the 1920s with a mathematics degree did not have much in the way of job prospects. And she heard about an offer from a German brewer in Cusco, Peru. There's still a German brewery in Cusco. If you go there, you'll find German beer in Cusco. But the brewmaster wanted a German-speaking governess for his children. And she accepted the job and went over and started working in Cusco. Only at the point that she got to Cusco did she find out that the German brewmaster really wanted a paramour. And she was not interested in that, so she left Cusco suddenly and went down to Lima, and the only jobs that she could find was as a translator and working in a German kindergarten. So in the 1930s, she's doing that. She meets Kosak, and he convinced her to start studying the Nazca lines. Peru was allied with the United States and the Allies in the Second World War. Germans and also Japanese were interned in Chile, in Peru. She was able to travel around Lima, but she could not leave Lima. So she could not, during the Second World War, study at Nazca, do anything there. And Kosak was back in Peru in 1948. They worked again at Nazca. And she ends up being the person that has spent more time, did spend more time studying the Nazca lines than anyone else, from the 1940s up through her death in the 90s. So there she is again and again. In 1977, I met her twice. That's the 2 of us talking. We talked about Paul Kosak when I mentioned that I was studying stuff from Paul Kosak, and I had actually met his son. Her eyes light up. It was very clear to me that Paul Kosak was the love of her life. And there I saw her again in 1983. I saw her a number of times. She was actually in the 80s living in one of the hotels in the town of Nazca and giving speeches to tourists that came down to see the Nazca lines. She died in 1998 at the age of 95. There she is from a National Geographic magazine article. That's what the Nazca lines look like down on the ground. It's places where the dark-colored soil or rocks have been moved off to the side, exposing the lighter-colored undersoil. There's one on the hillside. She had the theory that they were of astronomical significance, particularly like a calendar. A number of people have studied that since then, particularly Anthony Aveni at Colgate University, and have proved that that's not the case. Statistically, they don't line up with any kind of important things like the rise of the sun on a particular date, solstices or equinoxes or whatever, including also they look at the major star clusters and planets and so forth. They don't line up with anything astronomical other than by chance. To see the lines, the best way is to fly over them. I first flew over them in 1977 twice. The first time, my son, who was 3 years old at the time, did not like the fact that I went up flying. It was a plane that only carried 2 passengers, pilot and me. So later on, we did a second flight with my son sitting on my lap. The pilot would go, "Do you want to see the lines closer up?" And we'd go zoom down. And my son would throw up all over me. Today, you'll probably, if you're flying over the lines, and some of you from the port of Martin or Pisco, you may fly over the Nazca lines. You're probably flying over in a larger plane. I've flown over, I think, 8 times now. But this is the sort of view that you get. This is a satellite picture from NASA. But here's what you see from flying over. You'll see lines in the desert. Lots of lines. It's over a huge area. They're very fragile. These days, they try to keep anybody from driving out into the desert in this area. There are police patrols and stuff. Just driving out here will put new lines onto the desert. That's the Pan American Highway running through right there. But lots and lots of lines. Some of them clearly point towards hills. There are some small hills out in this desert. Some of them point to some of the larger mountains to the east. On this one, you can see several lines that point to that hilltop. And that's from that same hilltop, from looking down, you can see a line that just goes off from the top of the hill. There, the little hill, and you can see lines aiming right towards it. Or here, lines coming towards the hill, the big wide line coming towards the hill, and from the top of the hill, in the opposite direction, lines going off in several different directions. Some of the markings here, the geoglyphs, are not lines, but rather figurative sorts of things. There on the right center, you probably can see a bird, or here a little bit closer view of the bird. This one is supposed to be a flower. Here's another bird, or another bird there, or here, or there. There's a bird on the hillside, but another view of the same one. And there, one of the most famous ones is this one. It's usually referred to simply as the hummingbird. And hummingbirds do show up on the Nazca Huacos. There's the hummingbird. Something else to point out is that you can walk the line. If you start near the top of the screen and follow one of the lines, and you can just follow it along, and it will end you back up at the same place where you started. So that part of the ritual may be walking the line. We may be talking about here groups that were the hummingbird group, or the killer whale group, or another bird group, the pelican group, or whatever. They would have their temple, and once a year they would go and have their rituals and do their dances and so forth at Carhuachi, and as part of that they might go out into the desert and do their celebration on their line. That's the hummingbird. Here's one that's usually referred to as the coyote or the fox. They don't have coyotes here, but they do have lots of foxes. Or there's one that's called the killer whale. I showed you a wako earlier of a Nazca killer whale pot. That's the killer whale. That one is one of the real popular ones, and if you're on a flight over here, they will definitely fly you over the hummingbird, and they'll fly you over the spider. Usually, if they're flying around, they will fly it in one circle so people on one side of the plane get a picture, and then they'll do it in the opposite direction. And it's all today very, very controlled. A few years ago, a couple planes crashed together, and since then, as your pilot comes towards the Nazca lines, he will have to check in with the air controller, and they have to follow a certain circuit. It's not like it was back in the 80s and 90s where it was a free-for-all sort of thing. But there's our spider. And the spider is on Nazca pots, and spiders are found in this area. That's usually referred to as the monkey. And there is this one little guy. Many people refer to him as the spaceman, and Eric von Daniken took this one and said, that's the guy that was in the flying saucer. A little space guy. There are lots and lots of theories. Lots of people have studied these lines. A fellow by the name of Johann Reinhard, a National Geographic explorer, has argued that they're part of a cult of water worship. The Nazca area is a very dry desert, but in the mountains to the east there is rainfall, and a little bit of water comes down from the mountains. And if you're praying for rain, the Nazca lines may have something to do with that. Some of the lines point towards the nearby peaks. Other authors are suggesting that they were some sort of groups, either kinship groups or one little village or whatever, that had a temple at Carhuachi and also had their special lines, some sort of ceremonies that they would be doing. Now, one of the latest things that have been going on the last 3 or 4 years is that using drones, a group of Peruvian people, researchers, have found a whole new set of lines in the Palpa Valley, just 2 valleys or 1.5 valleys north of Nazca. They look to be earlier, prior to the Nazca culture, the early intermediate period, or the early horizon culture. And these are some of the new stuff. They're on the hills a little bit to the north of Nazca. They're quite a bit different. They're positive, that is to say, they've pulled away the dark rock, and what you're seeing, the white, is the removal thing. They're a positive image, they're not a negative image. You see these? These are all some of the new ones that have come out. And they seem to be related also to people from northern Chile that I'll be talking about in a few minutes. So that's some of the newest stuff. There is some rock art in the Nazca area in some of the hills. This is in the Palpa Valley also. There's a nice rock art on that boulder there. A closer view, a little hard to see. And again, I point out in this next slide that it's easy to make these lines in a desert. All you have to do is scrape away the top dark patina, and you can make a line. I made a Nazca line. That marker, that light color there on the right, that was my road going out to an archaeological site that I was excavating, had never been excavated before as part of my dissertation. And I created that line, that road on the right-hand side of the screen. One time I was driving back from being out at my site, and my eye just happened to catch, and can you see a Nazca type line, an old line, not a new road like mine on the right, but can you see that line going off in the distance there? This is on the north coast of Peru, one valley to the north of Trujillo, where some of us will be in a couple days. This is in the Chao Valley, south of Trujillo, two valleys south of Trujillo. And you can see a Nazca line there going off right in the center of the picture, or there's a closer view of it. My truck is at the bottom of that line. These lines are all over the coast. It isn't just Nazca. Nazca has the biggest concentration, and it's this famous spot, and all the tourists want to go there, but these are all over the coast of Peru. Now, when we get to Iquique, some of you are going to have a shore excursion. In fact, lots of you, because I think there are at least 4 or 5 different departures going out there, so it's got to be a bunch of people going out. You're going to go out into the Atacama Desert. This is the north coast of Chile. Notice right at the top of the screen where the angle of the coast changes. That's the approximate Peru-Chile border. There's actually a little river there, the Tacna River. On the right-hand side, those white things, those are the salt flats up on the Bolivian Altiplano. But this area to the west of the Andes Mountains along the coast, that's the Atacama Desert, one of the driest deserts in the world. They have places there where they say it's never rained. I've driven on the Atacama Desert many times, and I have been there where I had to have my windshield wiper because stuff was coming down, but don't tell anybody that it was rain. But I had to have my windshield wipers on. So here's a little bit closer view. There is a small river there called the Rio Loa, very tiny little rivers. But these are some shots. That was one that I didn't take. This is one of the pictures I took back in 1970, Atacama Desert. And that was camping out in the Atacama Desert. A little bit difficult if you're looking for a tree or a big rock to go behind. No big rocks and no trees. We were able to just camp out in the desert. That was actually with that truck, that was 1977. But there are a series of markings here, like geoglyphs, in this area of pintados. You'll see them on the sides of hills. This is the Pan American Highway in the foreground, and just on that hill you can see some stuff. And this is Pintados. Again, some of you are headed right out to this spot, east of Iquique. And lots of these geoglyphs on the hillsides. Up and down the hillsides. If you're going on this and you have a telephoto, take your telephoto because they're up on the hillsides. You can't get close to them very easily. These are old slides. But some of you will be seeing these. I like that little guy. Or here, can you see the guy with the spear? The truck down in the foreground gives you an idea of scale. Can you see him? Or here on the bottom left, what I refer to as Casper, the friendly ghost, and his friends. Kind of going around there. So, it's a real neat area. Unfortunately, there is an area here that you're not going to see that's a little bit more difficult to get to. In fact, I've never gotten to it, but I've seen it from afar. Out here in the desert, there's a spot called Tilaviche, and it's right there. And this is my picture, kind of a wide-angle shot. What we're looking at here is a spot right there. That's as close as you can get now. Here's a little bit closer view, right in the center. Or here with telephoto. And I found this picture on the web. This is real old. This is like 8 to 10,000 years old, and those are probably not llamas or alpacas. Those are guanaco, the wild ancestor of the llama. Big herd of guanaco. And so I got these two pictures off of the web. One last spot I want to talk about is rock art at a place called Ovalle. And day after, tomorrow we're going to be in Santiago. The day after that, we're going to be, I think, in La Serena, Coquimbo. We got two towns the next couple days. And Ovalle is a town a little ways south of Coquimbo. There's actually two towns right together, Ovalle, or Coquimbo and La Serena. They're twin towns. But Ovalle is about an hour's drive south of Coquimbo. Some of you probably have a shore excursion there. In fact, I tried to get on that shore excursion escort, and they said it was all full. There was no room. I've been there several times. And this is what the area looks like. Some of you are from Central California. We're from the Fresno area. And this looks like the hills on the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. It's the same sort of climate. It's the transition from a Mediterranean climate of Southern California into a little bit cooler climates. But this looks like Central California, hills of the San Joaquin Valley. This area at the time of the Spanish conquest, what the Spanish referred to as the Norte Chico, the little north, just to the north of Santiago, this transition zone between desert and the Central Valley area, had a culture that was fairly sophisticated. They had irrigation, agriculture. They were conquered by the Incas probably around 1470, about 2 generations before the arrival of the Spanish. And they had pretty good agriculture. They also were trading minerals to other areas. This is the area where lapis lazuli comes from. Going back earlier into around the time of Christ or a little bit after that, there was a less sophisticated culture, did not have irrigated agriculture. And these people are best known from a spot called the Valle del Encanto, the Enchanted Valley. It's about a few miles from the town of Ovalle, and it's when you're on that shore excursion, that's where you're headed for, that Valle del Encanto. So they were sedentary or semi-sedentary. They moved from the mountains down to the coast, depending on the time of the year. And hunters and collectors, they may have raised a few plants, corn and beans and squash and quinoa, things like that, maybe cotton. The pottery of the people from the time of this area, Valle Encanto, a little after the time of Christ, looks like this. It's not really sophisticated pottery like we saw for Nazca or we'll see in other Peruvian cultures that I'll talk about. But there is some. This is from a museum in Valparaiso. These are pictures that I took there. Again, not like what we see in parts of Peru. But again, this is the Valle Encanto. There's the Coquimbo, where we'll be anchored, or we'll actually be docked there. It's not a tender port. And there's where Ovalle is, about an hour's drive on a good freeway, a divided highway down to Ovalle. A little bit closer view. It's still desert, still quite dry, and this is looking down into the valley. And the bus will come down into this valley. You have to hike a little bit, but it's on a relatively flat surface, and it's not anything real difficult. Right at the bottom of the picture, if this was in California, and we have pictures exactly like this in Central California, that hole there in the thing in California would be called a BRM, a bedrock mortar. It's a hole in the hard rock that somebody has put in there as they were grinding corn or grinding grass seeds or grinding up whatever, quinoa or whatever. And you do this for long enough, you occupy the same spot for long enough, and you get these bedrock mortars. There are also some places called slicks at the bottom left. That's not really a bedrock mortar, but there is a spot where they were also grinding something. So there are 2 slicks. And there are lots and lots of bedrock mortars. indicates that people were living in this spot for a long time. There is a small stream that runs here seasonally. Be a good place to live. Lots of bedrock mortars. And then on the rocks in the area along that stream is rock art. It's going to depend on the time of day and the cloud cover what you're going to see, because some of this is pretty ephemeral. But on those rocks are rock art. Can you see a little bit there on the left-hand side on that big rock in the foreground? There's stuff scratched into it. Right there in the center. There's actually a figure with rays coming out of the top of the head, like a headdress. Or in the upper right corner of that rock, you can see the rays coming off of somebody's head a little bit better. So a lot will depend on the time of day and how the light is. Here at the bottom left, you can see it fairly clearly. In the middle center, you can see some fairly clearly. Or there. That's a pretty good picture of them. Very nice one there. This is this El Canto culture from around the time of a little after the time of Christ. Nice one there. And here a figure just to give you a sense of scale. Okay. I have a total of 2 minutes left. So just talked about the next one. We're going to talk about my 3 favorite Inca sites. Now you may be able to guess already what one of them is, and your guess is going to be wrong. Because it's 3 sites that you've never heard of. So my next lecture will be on the Incas on 3 sites you've never heard of, and then the last one is going to be on Machu Picchu. Hopefully see you then. Thanks a lot.